Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Bipartisan Policy Center. I'm Sasha Mackler, and I lead the energy project at the BPC. And we are really excited about the conversation we have lined up for you all today. Focus on a set of topics that are near and dear to the work here at the BPC and to so many of our viewers, the outlook for energy and climate policy this Congress. After more than a decade of political polarization, federal climate policy is beginning to become more mainstream. This is perhaps best illustrated by the successful support and passage of the Energy Act of 2020 in the last Congress, a bill that was focused on climate-friendly technology development. And now we have a new administration in office with ambitious climate policy plans and Democratic control of both chambers of Congress. It's clear that more climate policies are poised to come forward in the near term. This is the backdrop. At the BPC, we have a particular focus on innovation and in transitioning the electric power sector in the U.S. And we also, as everybody knows by now, have an obsession with political solutions that can generate bipartisan support. Climate on this front has obviously been tough, but it's possible we are entering into a new moment politically where a federal clean electricity standard, or a CES, can provide a framework and generate a coalition to deliver meaningful progress for the power sector in the near term. We have a great set of speakers here today to help unpack this topic. First, we are thrilled to have two members of Congress from both sides of the aisle working together on the only bipartisan CES legislation proposed so far. We'll have a conversation with Representatives David McKinley and Kurt Schrader about their Clean Energy Future Through Innovation Act. This will be followed by a discussion with a fantastic panel that will be moderated by my colleague, Leslie Jantarasamy. Let me remind our viewers to please submit questions using the live chat on YouTube or Facebook, or on Twitter using #BPCLive. I'll provide a quick introduction to both the congressmen, and then we'll jump into the conversation. Representative David McKinley is a Republican who has represented the 1st District of West Virginia since 2011. He has a seat on the Committee on Energy and Commerce, where he's been an active participant on issues related to the coal industry, environmental regulation, energy efficiency, and healthcare. He serves as the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Environment and Climate Change. And Representative Kurt Schrader is a Democrat, currently serving his 6th term, where he represents Oregon's 5th Congressional District. He also serves as a member on the House Energy and Commerce Committee, and serves on the Subcommittee on Health, the Subcommittee on Energy, and the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology. Thank you both for joining us today. Looking forward to the conversation. I'll also note at the outset that Congressman Schrader needs to leave us a little early, so we'll make sure he has time to get his thoughts across before he needs to depart. But let's start with you, Representative McKinley. Can you give us a little background on how you, a Republican from West Virginia, came to the climate issue? And in particular, can you explain how this bill that you've structured with Representative Schrader is put together? And I note kind of at the outset that you've combined two really important ideas: innovation and a technology-neutral clean energy standard. Why did you bring those together?
Sasha, probably the best way to describe this would be, if you look back under the Obama administration, what they talked about was putting these regulations in effect, that with the hope that innovation would follow in clean energy. Somehow how to reduce the carbon emissions. They set the standard, but it couldn't be met by any industry. And as a result, you saw a transformational change in how we make electricity across this country. As a result of that, they just closed the plants down because there's no innovation. We want to do the reverse. We're going to start with innovation, and we're going to give these utilities the tools and the technology to actually implement the changes that are necessary to reduce their carbon emissions. And then by virtue of this, Sasha, the secondary benefit for this is that, one, they'll be able to meet the standards, and secondly, we will have developed an affordable, efficient means of carbon emissions that we market around the world. because we have to make sure that people all around the world understand, and especially in America, that we can totally decarbonize here in America, but unless the rest of the world comes on board with us, particularly China and India and other nations, that these the emissions are still going to exist. We're still going to have wildfires on the West Coast. We're going to have droughts and flooding in the Midwest and hurricanes on the East until the rest of the world starts reducing its emissions. So we can be used as a model, but let's make sure we do the innovation first.
Great, thanks. So lead with innovation. Congressman Schrader, let's turn to you. Is there anything else you'd like to add as an overview of the bill, and what your goals are here? And your effort is the only bipartisan proposal so far, and so with Democrats in control of both chambers, why do you think it's important to still take a bipartisan approach?
Well, because it still takes 60 votes to get stuff done for the most part. Can't do reconciliation on every single bill that's out there. And to be honest, if you want lasting change, you need to have both parties, all parts of this country have buy-in and feel like they're represented in this legislation. We passed the ACA almost 10 years ago through this partisan reconciliation process, and my Republican colleagues have been chipping away at it ever since. I'd argue it's great legislation, could use some improvements, but it really gives health care to everybody. But that's not recognized, or wasn't recognized at the time. Now, come full circle, people are beginning to realize it's a great piece of legislation that does get people access where they had none before. Same thing here with energy. We go from one administration to another, ping-ponging the industry and consumers back and forth with different standards, different goals, to power plants, auto emissions, you name it. And there's no consistency. I think America gets confused. There's a bunch of misinformation out there. People are worried about their jobs. People are worried about the climate change in the world in general. So our bill is an attempt to bring America together. It's agnostic as to the source of energy. We don't demonize fossil fuels in this bill. What we do say is we all agree we have to reduce our carbon emissions. Let's give fossil fuels the same innovation and technological opportunities that we've given renewable energy. The bill has three parts. Lots of money, billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars are anticipated to be spent in improving innovation and technology in renewable energy. Better battery storage, better opportunities for collaboration, conservation. Tens of billions of dollars are spent on fossil fuel opportunities, carbon sequester, carbon capture that could occur. Engineers tell me that's possible. And lastly, but most importantly, in my opinion, we actually set a legislative carbon energy standard that will become law, won't be subject to the whims of who's in the executive office. And that way industry can make these 20, 30, 40-year investments with some assurance that they're going to matter, that at the end of the day, it's going to be a good investment. So I think for the sake of the country, this brings us all together, recognizes everyone has a stake in this game. Republicans as well as Democrats recognize that climate change is real. We may disagree as to the causes, perhaps, but we want to make this better. And we want to be able to bring the world along, like David said, by us inventing, frankly, a lot of the technology. America benefits twofold. One, we get all these other countries on board that are more major contributors to pollution, India, China, others. And secondly, we sell them our technology. It's great for jobs, makes America, I think, the leader, and improves our own economy.
Thanks. Let's talk a little bit about how your proposal differs from maybe some of the other ideas that have been floated on the Hill or by the administration. What are some of the trade-offs that you two had to kind of work through as you developed this bill?
Let me take a swing at a little bit at that. First, I want to compliment Kurt Schrader because our office has been working on this for almost 4 years, and we wanted to make sure we had some substance. We wanted to talk with our placeholders, make sure that there was support for this concept because it is somewhat innovative to be adopted for Republicans to be adopting a CES. So it's refreshing and it's encouraging that Kurt Schrader is now how articulate he is on bringing this in, that we're eliminating the uncertainty. So, but he and I are still negotiating. We know we have to keep doing this because one of the key components of this that we have not been able to hammer out yet is a new source review to make sure the plants are going to be able to renovate their facilities rather than shut them down because too many right now are intimidated with the permitting process and it's just easier just to shut it down and switch over to something else. But we've still got life left in that plant. So rather than go spend a lot more money building a whole new infrastructure, we can use what we have. I think Texas and California and others would probably benefit from having some additional facilities available to them that otherwise were prematurely shut down. So one of the negotiations is that's a compromise. The other compromise is for Republicans to accept the CES, the Clean Energy Standard. They're not real keen on this because they've been able to, over the years, be able to push back against that. But at the same time, that people have had to recognize that we need to have some innovation. That the amount of money we were putting in innovation. So Kurt and I first we got those two sides pretty well balanced. Now we're not arguing, but we're negotiating how we can best find a new source standard that meets the objections or how we can get past some objections that could be out there. People that are concerned about any relaxing of a control. I don't necessarily see it as relaxing. I think it's more focused, and that's one thing that I really like working with Kurt is someone with the background that he has in science is how we're going to focus in on what the problem is and how we can resolve that through the new source review.
Yeah, the new source review has always been a tough issue to navigate when it comes to power plants and regulatory policy. Representative Schrader, what are some of the trade-offs that you had to make, and what are some of the priorities that you're really sort of focused on in this bill?
Well, big trade-off as a Democrat is recognizing that fossil fuels have a potential place in the future. My party tends to demonize fossil fuels, and there's a argument about what is a fossil fuel at the end of the day, and I think that's the wrong discussion. What is our goal? Our goal is to reduce carbon emissions. That's our goal, no matter what the source of fuel is. I don't care if it's hydropower, solar, or wind. We're trying to reduce carbon emissions. Nuclear plants reduce carbon emissions. So if that's true, then we should not care about what fuel source it is. So that's tough for Democrats to get their head around. But on the flip side, Republicans are rolling the dice a little bit also, saying that, all right, we agree that carbon emissions are bad for the planet, bad for us. We want part of the solution. We're going to, basically say we're going to get our carbon emissions down, whether it's a coal plant, natural gas plant, petrochemical plant. We're going to get our emissions down to near zero by 2050. And we're going to roll the dice that we're able to do that by innovation and technology. To David's point, Democrats give up the my way or the highway regulatory approach. Democrats, for a period of time, while everyone is working in good faith, will promise not to promulgate new energy rules that upset the apple cart. There is a review, an annual review that goes in our bill, where the Secretary of Energy monitors how all these different power plants are working, making sure they're making progress towards their energy goals. If they are not over a rolling time period, then boom, they're in big trouble. So there's some big trade-offs here. Everyone has really come to the table, I think, in really good faith, trying to get our energy emissions down, taking some huge risks, but at the same time, seeing some great opportunities. And I'll point out, as a blue dog Democrat that's concerned about our debt and deficit, believe it or not, there's still a few people out here that do worry about how much we're spending these days. We did make an exception for climate change in our rules package. We are aware of the fact that this is a huge, huge problem for not just our generation, but generations to come. And investments in research and technology to reduce our emissions would be exempt from PAYGO under our rules. And that's a requirement that everything we do has to be paid for at the end of the day. So I think we're really on track given the way this Congress is set up, given the ping ponging back and forth, for everyone to jump in the pool together and say we're going to try and get this done and work together to do so.
Well, we
Sasha,
certainly commend. Yeah,
Sasha,
sure.
could I jump in on that one? Is reinforcing again the difference in our bill and any others. Ours is bipartisan. And no one else has advanced anything this, and I know it's been said, but let's reinforce that, because for something to get out of a 50-50 tie in the Senate, there needs to be consideration of that. And for even us in the House, it needs to be bipartisan. That's what America wants. That's what the people sitting across their breakfast tables want to see us working together. And I think that's what Kurt and I have been able to do over the last numbers of years, is working together, as compared to what we're facing maybe in a few weeks or months coming up, is going to be what it looks like a very partisan piece of legislation coming out of Frank Pallone's office, that's going to push energy in a way it's just simply partisan. That could it pass the House? Yes, but it won't meet with the respect in the Senate. So Kurt and I are trying to we want to stay hard and fast on a bipartisan approach that's cutting through, that none of the others have that opportunity, so that we can actually get something done. And it's not just a messaging bill to stir up our base. We want to get something accomplished.
Well, thank you. We certainly commend that spirit, and we'll get to the politics in a second. But maybe one question before that is, how have the stakeholders that are central to this legislation, the utilities themselves, the labor community, the environmental groups, how have you worked with them, and how have they responded to the package you've put together so far?
I think they've responded pretty well so far. David and his team have worked very, very hard. My team's helped to try and get this bill out there. It's not something that David and Kurt thought up. This is the work of years that Congressman McKinley's office has put in to take into account the different concerns and considerations of all the three groups you just talked about. I think it's a win-win for labor. It means tens of billions of dollars of investment in energy projects across the country, not just centered on the left coast or in the center of this country. I think we have a great opportunity to really create working men and women's family wage jobs. The environmental community is very interested, because it is bipartisan, and has a chance of becoming law and actually passing and bringing again a clean energy standard into statute. That's a big deal. That's a big deal. So a lot of the environmental groups are showing extreme interest right now. We're going to look at, we're still a work in progress. And, for the fossil fuel industry, for a lot of the electric power folks, they want certainty. They're making tens of billions of dollars of investments, and they want some certainty. Most businessmen and women will tell you, I can make my business successful, but just give me some certainty. Tell me what the rules of engagement are, so that I can actually make investments on behalf of my ratepayers or my investors, whatever the case may be, and actually get to where we need to go. But let's not waste money, and let's be smart about where we're going. So I think industry is also very, very central to this, and all three groups have been playing heavily in our legislation so far.
Let me add to that, and that is, we've got to stop this demonizing our fossil fuels, and get all of the above. Not just in a speech talk about we support all the above, but actually doing it. And I think that's what we're basing a lot of this on, is trying to make sure that you're going to use all our energy sources. Of course, we're going to have nuclear and wind and solar and hydro, but let's also keep in mind that around the world, they're still using fossil fuels in a big way, and we need to do that, and we're going to continue to do that in America as well. So I I think our stakeholders are talking a little bit about this as well. And they're saying we have to understand the impact that these legislation that otherwise is not bipartisan, the impact it's going to have on state governments, what it's going to do. For example, Alaska, Alaska gets 70% of its revenue, state revenue, comes from fossil fuels. Wyoming, 52% of the revenue to run the state of Wyoming comes from fossil fuels. That means their education system, their police, all their healthcare systems, their pensions, all dependent on this. In North Dakota, it's 45%. I think our stakeholders are becoming more aware of the consequences of us doing away with fossil fuels. And what Kurt and I, what we're working on is a way that respects the dignity of work for those individuals in those communities so that they have an opportunity to continue. And the power plants will continue to operate in a very cost effective way. But we're taking into consideration the jobs of individuals across this country. So stakeholders are getting that. And I want to reinforce what he's saying, that we've met with many of the environmental NGOs, and they're looking at that too, because this will provide some certainty to this process. And instead of every 4 years, we change our state of flux that we go into. So I'm very encouraged that this thing can get legs. We just got to get people to put aside their partisan differences and show how, if he and I can work together, and we've had a good relationship, we ought to get that across to other people as well.
Thank you, Congressman. And I know that we're approaching the time when Representative Schrader needs to leave us. So maybe I will, propose a question for you that can enable you to kind of share some closing remarks as well. And this comes from Stephanie, and who is watching online, and she is wondering how you are managing your Democratic colleagues on this issue, who, as we know through the Biden administration and their goals for the power sector, which are net zero by 2035, which is more ambitious than the bill you're putting forward here, and the activities through Chairman Pallone that are who are also putting together what appears to be a more ambitious CES proposal. What sort of work are you doing with your caucus to see where they might land on a proposal like this?
Well, I think the name of the game is, what's real, what can actually get done. Our chairman of the Energy Commerce Committee that David and I serve on, that deals with the energy issues where this bill will come out of, is actually favorably disposed to the outline that David and I have. He sees the value in the bipartisan nature of it. Our committee, by and large, operates in a bipartisan manner. Most major pieces of legislation, frankly, most all legislation that comes out of our committee has bipartisan support. So I think Chairman Pallone is very, very interested in that. Ranking Member McMorris Rodgers comes from my neck of the woods in the Northwest, and she also is very inclined towards that. I've worked with her on a number of other power plant issues. So I think there's genuine interest in our committee about moving forward this way. The bill itself, the outline of the bill, where we're going with carbon emission standards, is similar to the other bills that are put forward just by Democrats. So it's not out of the mainstream of thinking. It's not like we're asking our Democratic colleagues to readjust their whole thinking. The time frame, yeah, that's an issue. But let's see what happens there. 2035, I think, is pretty unrealistic, with all due respect to my colleagues. 2050, maybe we don't need to go that long. Let's have that discussion. I talked to folks in the power sector industry, folks back home, where they're much more aggressive and they feel they can meet these goals perhaps before 2050. That's a part of the discussion. That's part of the legislative process that has yet to play out. David and I don't have a stake in the ground. It has to be exactly this because it's in our current legislative language. We're willing to work with folks, but we want to be realistic. We do not want to, put people out of work. We want to set up realistic expectations with that innovation and technology that's going to develop. So that's the way I work with my colleagues. And I think the name of the game is to keep an open mind here. not shut yourself off, respect the other person's position. That's the whole thing here in Congress in general, and certainly when it comes to energy and carbon emissions. You have to accept the fact the other person has a legitimate point of view. You may disagree, you may not think that's the right thing to do, but you got to remember there's a big difference between the Pacific Northwest and coal country West Virginia. Now, I respect the fact that a lot of folks work really hard, and these are fellow Americans, and they do not want to feel like they're being left behind, that their opinion matters. And so I care about that a lot as a legislator. And David's willing to accept some of my crazy left-wing folks out there in Oregon and Washington and say, okay, I don't agree with some of this stuff, but you have a legitimate point of view. And if people in Congress adopted what David and I are trying to, the mentality David and I have right now, I think we'd be in a much, much better spot. And that's our goal through the committee and through the Congress. And I do have to go, guys.
Well, thank you for joining us today, and thanks for your leadership on this issue. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks, everybody. Take care. David, take care of this. He knows it better than I.
Congressman McKinley, just a few more questions, I think, before we turn it over to the next panel. Can you say a little bit about the next steps with respect to your process here in the bill? Do you plan to introduce it again this Congress, and what's the process you're going
absolutely.
through?
We're going to reintroduce it. And I think our next step is also to start embracing more folks on the other side of the aisle on this, particularly Nancy Pelosi. And then we've already begun conversations in the Senate to getting someone so we have a companion piece of legislation over there to do the same thing. So we're moving on that arena. I think that's the best way. Yes, it certainly is going to be reintroduced, and we're trying to get more support from the other side and from industry as well, because I'm afraid in building off a little bit of what Kurt just was saying about a lot of the industries, utilities, I've talked to a huge number across the country on this subject. They're already talking about going to net zero by 2050, but their solution to get to 2050 is just to do away with fossil fuels. Because they know the innovation isn't there, the technology isn't there to be able to do it. So they're just they will shut down all their gas and coal and oil plants and bring in power. We had a conversation with PJM the other day, and they'll get their power when they need it from New York and ISO New England, as well as over in the South. So other people, they're looking at other ways of bringing in power. But at the same time, what have we done? What have we done to the individuals? What have we done to the communities by shutting them down, by not keeping all of the above truly as part of the mix? So I think that's one thing, Kurt, we're solid on, is we want to make sure that all of the above is considered, and don't destroy these communities, the culture and the fabric of those areas. It's not just West Virginia. They mine coal in 26 states. Think about that from Wyoming. I rattled off earlier some of those, but think about what effect it's going to have if this were to go in a partisan fashion and these fossil fuel was done away with, as Pallone has already talked about, by 2035. That's not realistic. I think that's where I'm a structural engineer. We deal in very pragmatic solutions that can be accomplished. And Kurt, coming from his science background, the same way. Let's find out what can be done, not just ginning up our base, but let's get a solution that can be placed, and it will have broad support.
Yeah, thank you. And we had a conversation with Senator Manchin, your colleague from West Virginia, several weeks ago, who made a very, very similar point, quite strongly, on the need to be focused on the transition as part of any of these policies. So we're hearing that loud and clear from you and your colleagues. This is just a reminder to folks who are watching. If you have questions, please share them so we can fold them into the conversation. And I'll ask one here from Andrew Moisef, who is wondering, can you lay out the steps to getting this piece of legislation finalized out of committee and on the floor of both chambers? Do you have a rough timeline?
There is no timeline on that, because we know that and Kurt just mentioned it, in committee, in the Energy and Commerce, I've been on that now for 11 years. Right now, we're up against the chairman has his own piece of legislation. And they dropped it yesterday, or they're going to drop it this week and put it into the hopper so that we're going to have competing versions. So what our next step really has to be, we have to sit down with Frank Pallone and Nancy Pelosi, just find out what's their objective. What's the objective? Do you want to just get a bill passed that dies in the Senate, doesn't accomplish anything, or do you seriously want to look at addressing this in a bipartisan fashion? And I don't mean to demean that. I think they passionately believe they need to reduce the CO2 emissions as quickly as possible. So they're talking about 2035, all fossil fuel emissions will be zero. Can that be done? Yes, but that means the fossil fuel industry will go into a hiatus. It'll be done in 2035 because we will not have the ability to put on the capturing devices that we need in the sequestration. So they'll be done by 2035. If people can come to that understanding on the committee, we can move our legislation. But as long as people are in denial of the consequences of what it has on communities, like I rattled off in Alaska and Wyoming, North Dakota, if they understand that, I'm hoping that people will be more compassionate about, as Kurt talked about, the people all over, either in gas fields across this country or in the coal areas. Let's make sure that we consider them. They're part of America as well. And as we go forward with that, I think you'll see the chairman will become more amenable to our legislation. At least that's the plan. Someone shows me otherwise, then we'll consider how we might be able to adopt something. But I'm still hoping we can make this bipartisan and not have something jammed down our throats.
We appreciate
Okay.
that. And speaking of bipartisanship and of Senator Manchin, who is in a leadership position in the Senate Energy Committee, have you discussed this with Senator Manchin? And do you have any thoughts on how this bill might be received in the other chamber?
Our staff has talked to his staff. I've talked to the Republican members over in the Senate. That's why we're trying to get some. So we're going to look at a bipartisan approach in the Senate as well to get that. And we're getting some very positive feedback that that's a strong possibility to be able to do that. And it'll be a carbon copy of what we have in the House version. So we just got to keep these negotiations continuing so that we get our final bill put together. The bill we introduced last year was incomplete, but it laid the groundwork of where we know we still had to work. So I think that yes, the Senate's crucial to this, and we're going to have to have a companion over there as well.
Great. I know we just have a couple minutes left, so
time-wise, you have one more question?
That's it. We're just going to wrap up with this final question. Thanks. From Jonathan Berman. How does a carbon tax compare to what you're thinking about doing here?
Thus far, we have avoided that because we don't see there's an appetite for a carbon tax. We know people have talked about carbon tax or carbon pricing. We remember we went through years ago before I came here was a cap and trade issue. All those issues are somewhat polarizing. And ultimately, anytime you put a carbon tax or something like that on there, you're increasing the cost to the consumer. And the utility companies, it's just a pass through. The consumer is going to pay for it. I strongly believe that we won't need to do that. If we can do the innovation, finding ways to capture the carbon, we won't need to have that. The technology is still emerging, but it's already showing up. We have Net Power down in Texas has actually demonstrated using the alum cycle that they can go to zero emissions. Let's just find out how can we adopt that across the country? People flipping from the Rankine over to the alum cycle, is that a way to save it? Let's find out. So this is part of this innovation for 10 years. For 10 years, no new regulations, but intense investment in innovation. And once we come out of that, then we're going to be able to transport that through trade or whatever to other nations. Because, as I said in my opening remarks, American can we can't. But what about the rest of the world? When we're burning about 750 million tons, and China is burning 5 billion tons, in India 1.1 billion tons. Those are the nations we need to focus on. So we're going to show them through our innovation how they might be able to achieve it, and ultimately we'll have a cleaner environment. So thank you very much for the chance to chat with your group, and I hope we can follow up with us. This thing's I think it's one of the most important pieces of legislation that I've dealt with in the last 11 years. Thank you very much.
Well, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time today, for talking through these issues with us, and for your leadership. We really do hope we can work together and bring these solutions forward. So we really, really appreciate your efforts.
Thank you, Sasha.
Thank you, Congressman. I am going to turn it over now to my colleague, Leslie, who will introduce and moderate the next panel. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Sasha. Yep, thanks for everyone for sticking with us here for the next panel. I'm going to spend a few minutes on introductions for the three panelists that are joining us today, and then we'll just jump right into kind of building off of the themes we heard from the previous speakers and asking some more questions on clean energy standards in general. So we're joined today by Jeff Ling, who's the Director of Energy and Environmental Policy at Xcel Energy. In this role, he's responsible for developing strategy and policies that continue the company's leadership in transitioning to clean energy while keeping customer bills low. And Jeff's also the current chair of EEI's Global Climate Change Subcommittee. We're also here with Heather Zykal, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the American Clean Power Association, which is the leading federation of companies from across the clean power sector. Heather served as Deputy Assistant to the President for Energy and Climate Change during the Obama administration. She brings deep experience in the public and private sector to lead ACP's work to transform the US power grid to a low-cost, reliable, and renewable power system. And then we're here with Brad Markell, who works in the President's Office at AFL-CIO and serves as the Executive Director of both the AFL-CIO Industrial Union Council and the Working for America Institute. He leads the energy policy work at AFL-CIO, including chairing the Federation's Energy Task Force and coordinating with affiliates to develop policy positions that broadly advance the interests of workers in energy-producing and energy-intensive sectors. So, Jeff, I'm going to start out with just a question for you and kind of framing what Xcel Energy has committed to in terms of delivering 100% carbon-free energy by 2050 with an interim target of an 80% reduction by 2030. So how are you thinking about a federal CES and how it might impact this path, towards reaching your goals?
Well, thank you. Good morning, Leslie. I really appreciate the invitation to be part of the discussion here. Xcel Energy was the first major electric utility to commit to carbon-free energy by 2050. And as you said, that has a component as well, an interim component of an 80% reduction by 2030. So we made that announcement in December of 2018. And since then, over 24 of our colleague utilities, our Edison Electric Institute colleague utilities, have made commitments of their own of zero or net zero by mid-century. I'll point out that these targets are in line with both 2 degrees C and 1 degree C futures. So that's really important that it's grounded in the climate science. As you know, the power sector is no longer the biggest source of emissions in the US. That belongs now to the transportation sector and did as of 2016. As a company, we announced last week that we've reduced CO2 emissions 51% since 2005 as of the end of 2020. So better than half of the progress toward a carbon-free aspiration. You mentioned our 80% target by 2030. And we also announced last week plans around a clean energy plan in Colorado that we actually think is going to achieve an 85% reduction by 2030. And that plan really broadly includes a doubling of wind, solar, and battery storage over the next decade, some 5,500 megawatts of new capacity, 1,300 megawatts of firm dispatchable generation, including natural gas, which is really important as we go to very high levels of renewables. And then converting coal plants, changing their operation, in some cases early retirements as well. These are the types of strategies that we think are affordable, reliable, safe, and clean. And I think they're the types of things that we look for as a company in the design of a clean energy standard. So we do support a national climate policy through legislation if it's well designed. And in fact, we endorsed Congresswoman DeGette's Clean Energy Innovation and Deployment Act last summer in the previous Congress. As you know, there are many CES proposals and there are variations on a theme. The details really matter, and I'll talk about 5 components that I think might be recurring in our conversation here. First, it's got to be consistent with the aspiration, and we heard the representatives talk about where the power sector is going. So consistent with that 100% by 2050 aspiration. Secondly, it's really got to keep states in the driver's seat on resource planning. And we've got a pretty rich history of electric resource planning or integrated resource planning, working with our state regulators to maintain reliability. Third, I think compliance flexibility is really important to maintaining affordability. And in part of that is including some sort of preemption or pause on further regulation or double regulation, as it's sometimes referred to. Representative McKinley talked about that, right? The idea of a pause on additional regulation. Number 4, crediting for existing generation, existing natural gas, existing nuclear, and new natural gas, or at least partial credit for natural gas, is really, really important as we integrate very, very high amounts of renewables, doubling renewable energy by the next decade. Finally, and something that I hope we can return to, innovation, right? Solving for a 2030 timeframe with current technology is important. But after 2030, we know today we're going to need some new forms of technology to get there. So a CES has to be really intentional about pulling those new technologies that are 24/7, zero carbon into the marketplace. Specific to the proposal from Representatives McKinley and Schrader, we certainly like the focus on technology. We certainly appreciate the pause on additional regulation that I think does really provide certainty. And I think probably most importantly, we really appreciate the bipartisanship. So Leslie, I'll conclude there. I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Jeff. Actually, Heather, I'm going to jump over to you now. I'm curious how your members are thinking about how much federal CES approach and the attention it's getting in Congress.
Great. Well, thanks for the opportunity to join you today. And I'm very lucky to be joined with Jeff and obviously Brad as well. But Jeff does get a shout out for being a member of the American Clean Power Association. And I think there's a lot of overlap in terms of what he said and certainly the position of our membership. The American Clean Power Association is a relatively new trade association that's focused on bringing all clean energy under one roof and speaking with a united voice around clean energy policies in Washington, D.C. So we represent wind, both on and offshore, solar, storage, and transmission. We believe that a clean energy standard is if you take a big step back and you look at what are the sort of policy drivers today for clean energy, it's safe to say I think we kind of have a national climate policy that was put together with shoestring and chewing gum. We've got state level policies, we have some regional climate policies. And then a lot of what we're doing in Washington is actually driven by the tax code. And for our member companies, certainty and predictability is key. We believe that a clean energy standard, putting a long-term price on carbon, providing that flexibility, reliability, we believe that a well-considered CES can approach the economic efficiency of emissions reductions achieved under a carbon pricing approach. And in fact, we at ACP have done some modeling to kind of understand the implications and what those opportunities look like. The study was done by Wood Mackenzie, and we sort of started with the premise that if you could achieve 50% by 2030 through a clean energy standard, what would that look like? What are the outputs? And I think that the good news is there's a pretty terrific story. Renewable build out will deploy over $1 trillion in capital investments in U.S. infrastructure, including investments in local and rural communities. It'll create 1 million new good-paying jobs, nearly 2.3 times as many jobs as currently employed by fossil fuel power plants and the extraction activities that feed those plants. And these jobs will be well-paying, with representative annual wages ranging from 60 to 110K. Importantly, it lowers carbon emissions in addition to reducing harmful air pollutants that can lead to asthma and other respiratory illness. The clean energy deployment will lower emissions from the electric sector by 76% below 2005 values, helping meet most of the targets set under the Paris Agreement. So as a whole, we like the regulatory certainty and predictability. We believe there are many, many benefits, whether that's environmental or economic, to such a policy. And certainly, I think it's safe to say that the American Clean Power Association and our member companies will be engaging with the Hill and the administration as discussions around this policy move forward.
Thanks so much, Heather. Brad, Heather had mentioned jobs, and I know there have been a lot of studies out there. Obviously, the implications of passing a federal clean energy standard go beyond just electric generation, but also into potentially growing the domestic supply chain for supporting clean energy build out. And so what kind of impact are you thinking about when it comes to domestic job creation? What are some of your priorities for federal CES?
Well, thanks, Leslie, and thanks for having us in this discussion. Really appreciate it. And Heather, good to be with you again. Focusing on jobs and job quality is probably the number one thing that labor unions do, and that gets pretty complicated pretty quickly. So, right now we don't see the same job quality in the green sector as we see in the fossil sector. So I think what that means to us is we're looking for a clean energy approach, whether that is going to end up being through the Clean Air Act or through legislation. Energy and Commerce is releasing a bill today, early this afternoon. It's a 900-page bill, so there's going to be a lot in there. Some of the complementary policies are really, really important to labor. Are we going to have labor standards that are attached at all to this legislation or to anything we do through regulation? Are we going to land the domestic market share? A defining feature of the clean energy economy is that a bunch of spending that used to be on fuels becomes spending on a manufactured item. So if we don't win the clean energy manufacturing race, we don't win the clean energy economy. It's really, really important that we talk about what the supply chain looks like. This Biden supply chain executive order is an outstanding start just to wrap our hands around where we are. And the bottom line is we can regulate and incentivize clean energy. We're going to have to do it in a pretty quick fashion to meet our goals and avoid the worst effects of climate change. We also have to have a lot of wraparound policies that make sure that it works out for workers and communities.
Thanks, Brad. I'm curious, following from the previous discussion, that really focused a lot on kind of the politics and some of the process on talking about federal CES proposals within Congress. I'd be curious to hear from each of you about how you've been engaging with Congress and the administration around federal clean energy policy. Jeff, maybe we can start with you.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to discuss. I think some of the key elements that I talked about are really important, and those are the things that we've really been focused on, right? So we've got to have the ability to remain flexible through, those interim targets with current technology, but then vitally important, and we have to sort of move it from a important but not urgent, right, into the important and urgent quadrant, the focus on new technology. 9 years, a decade is really a blink of an eye in utility resource planning. And we've got to get started now, and really with some urgency, I would say, around new technology. So we spend a lot of time thinking about what is the research and development spending, what are the deployment policies, what are the commercialization policies, technology neutral tax credits, that are going to pull these new approaches into the marketplace in the 2030s when we know we're going to need them. You know, the power sector may take on a significant amount of new work across the economy through electrification. Transportation is the obvious one, but also industrial uses, oil and gas, other applications. And so if the power sector is indeed a pathway to a low carbon economy, we've really got to have the electrification tools to do that. I also do think, since Heather mentioned it as well, you know, tax policy is really, really important here. Direct cash payments in lieu of a tax credit, in addition to or in lieu of making the tax credits refundable, is really important to using the credits that companies have already accrued, right, and deploying as much clean energy as possible. So those are some of the themes as we engage on really any federal climate policy, but specifically at CES, that we really are focused on.
Great, thanks. Heather, would you like to follow on?
Absolutely. You know, our association as a whole sees tremendous opportunity with the new Biden administration as well as Congress to to advance our shared goals of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and creating jobs. And I think we have been engaging with both. It's clear to me that the Biden administration very much is moving quickly and aggressively on the broader climate agenda, and that you can see that from the kinds of nominees that they are populating the government, you know, senior government positions with, and cabinet officials. And you know, some of the very first actions that we saw from this administration to move the climate agenda forward, whether that was, as Brad mentioned, the supply chain EO, all the way to the recommitment with Paris, and the reversing some of the more problematic provisions from the previous administration. So we see great opportunity not only to think through sort of the long-term climate policies, but then what are those near-term opportunities to create jobs, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and to enhance clean energy deployment. And I think big picture, they kind of fall into three buckets, whether you're talking to the Hill or whether you're talking to the administration. For us, it's tax, as Jeff said. Things like standalone storage, ITC, could be a potential game change for that storage that he was talking about. Additionally, I can't underscore enough how important 100% direct pay is. And a lot of the reason behind that is because there's real challenge in the tax equity markets today, and a policy like that, I think, could significantly enhance deployment of clean energy in a very effective manner. On the transmission policy, there are a lot of siting and permitting issues that can be even resolved through existing authorities at agencies like the Department of Interior and FAA. So we're obviously engaging there, but we're also interested in working with the new chairman of the FERC, because we see opportunities to address everything from cost allocation to enhanced siting and permitting. Transmission today has the potential to be sort of a significant bottleneck to clean energy deployment. And from a jobs creation perspective, it's huge. So working not only to think about where do agencies have existing authorities, sorry, I apologize. And then let me just quickly wrap by saying the last area is on trade policy. There are a variety of trade policies that from Section 201, 301 that we are engaging with the administration to try and land our to engage in a dialogue about how some of the existing tariff structures have been disadvantaging our member companies. So those are the big three: tax, trade, and transmission. And then obviously those things ladder up to the discussion about a clean energy standard and how important it is not only to get that long-term policy in place to hit those 2050 targets, but aggressive interim standards to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the 2030 and 2035 range, as Jeff was talking about. We will continue to engage with the administration and Congress as there are different legislative proposals, and as members in the administration are thinking through some of the more meaningful design components of the broader clean energy, the clean energy standard itself.
Were you calling on me next? Is that what's going on, Leslie? We couldn't hear you.
That's right. Yeah. Can you hear me?
I can now. And Heather, I think anybody that knows you would have guessed dog person. So
they just were really jealous. They wanted to be heard.
Ditto to a lot of things that were already said. Obviously, labor is engaged with the administration in a very significant way up and down the chain, all the way from leadership to the staff level. Some of the things that President Biden has done so far are very, very positive for labor. The executive order on climate talked about well-paying union jobs. And, President Biden is the most pro-labor president, certainly in my lifetime. Congress has been fantastic. Energy and Commerce is dropping their clean energy bill today. It's a nice piece. There's a lot of work to do. There's going to be hearings. I will say, we're on some of the things that were mentioned, the tax credits and direct pay are things that we're interested in. We're always looking for some little hooks in there about standards and domestic content and so on. We'll see how that discussion goes. Really, really interested in things like some technology neutral standards, technology neutral tax credits. All those things matter. Existing nuclear is big on our list. We have to do something about the tax credits and the way that markets are being driven. And I'm maybe the last person that needs to say this, but our view is that price formation in electricity markets is deeply flawed and gives us a lot that cross currents and gives us outcomes we don't like. I don't think that's on the plate now, but we have to do a lot of workarounds because of the way our electricity markets are structured. And maybe to end where Heather began, transmission is a big deal. And we want to do something about permitting transmission, building transmission, because it will unlock not just hundreds of millions of dollars in transmission investment, but investment in clean energies. So,
Thanks, Brad. We have about 15 minutes left, so I wanted to remind the members of our audience to please submit any questions you may have for our panelists through the chat on YouTube, or you can use the hashtag BPC Live on Twitter. We actually do have a question that's come in that I think is relevant to some of the themes we heard in the previous conversation related to historic fossil fuel communities and the energy transition. So Thomas has asked, how can we direct innovation investments to these communities? And how are you all thinking about some of the policy implications of just transition for these communities?
I think it's
Leslie, I'm happy to start. Yeah, go ahead, Heather.
Go ahead, Jeff. Go for it.
So, for us, this is a really, really important topic. If you look over the last decade in Xcel Energy service territory, if you look at the Clean Air, Clean Jobs program in Colorado, if you look at the Metro Emissions Reductions program in Minnesota, we've actually been able to effect a transition away from coal toward natural gas and renewables in a way that we've done so without layoffs. And that's something that we intend to accomplish in the future as well. And we do that through attrition, through retirements, through retraining, finding jobs for employees within the Xcel Energy system. So that's the direct partnership with labor unions, and we hope for that to continue. Specific to the communities, I think it's really important that we are proactive, that we're transparent. We talk a lot with our employees and with our bargaining unit management. It's really important, secondly, that we communicate early and many times before our public announcements with plant management about closures. So it is, as much advance time as possible is really important for communities. I talked about preventing layoffs. We work closely on that in transitioning roles, again, within the Xcel Energy system. But also importantly, and this is one that I think we don't talk enough about, the role that utilities and the electrics companies can play in economic development, really in trying to bring new employers to a community, to keep the tax base up, to find, again, new employment opportunities, and really bring new employers to communities. We have a robust economic development program within our industry, and I think actually that's going to be one of the bigger solutions in this transition.
Thanks so much, Heather. You wanted to jump in next?
Yeah, I think obviously many of the points that Jeff made were spot on. And I think part of this is actually just a broader discussion about, what is the right way to ensure a just transition. And I think there are a lot of issues that we can move on today. I also think the fact that the Biden administration has prioritized this equitable transition is also creating a lot of new dialogues about exactly what are the pieces and how do we do that effectively. And, I think I see a lot of our member companies certainly leaning into that discussion and wanting to find new ways to partner with the Biden administration. But I also kind of feel like it is kind of an evolving conversation with evolving ideas about how best to do that. And I think, I think over time we're going to be able to fine tune and refine a broader agenda around these issues.
Well,
Thanks, Brad. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, well, of course, the whole notion of just transition emerged from the labor movement about 15 or 20 years ago, and we worked very hard to get the language in the Paris Agreement, and you'll see some language in the Energy and Commerce Bill today. I think 2 points. One is when we talk about just transition, the crux of the matter is what was mentioned: driving investment into those communities. What if you come to us with something around job training, we are going to lose our mind because we've been through this. Training does not create jobs. Investment creates jobs. So that's the first thing. When we think about what to invest, we're very focused, and I'm glad technology and technology development is super important to us. So, for example, during the Biden administration, DOE ran a program called Sunshot that was very, very successful in bringing down the cost of solar, 80, 90%. What Sunshot wasn't good at was helping us understand how do we land solar manufacturing in the U.S. We're sort of in reverse on that right now. And so we think there's a real play, a technology play around America's innovation edge, and then making sure that the things that we innovate land here and create jobs here. And so that 1-2 about investing in communities and then capturing the future technology and making sure that we're really making all this stuff here and that we're moving the U.S. forward as fast as we can down the technology path, because we've got a lot of competitors that are frankly better at it than we are.
Yeah, that's great, Brad. And I think you brought up some issues around technology, and we're sort of thinking about, depending on the structure of a federal CES, there's opportunity to facilitate a more diverse energy supply. And I'd be curious, Jeff, if you've thought a little bit more on those questions of diversity within the energy supply, how this may benefit utilities and potentially ratepayers.
Yep, it's a great question, Leslie. Thank you. I think fundamentally, a diversity of energy supply maintains affordability, right? And it keeps bills low for consumers. If you look over the last decade, the average Xcel Energy customer has spent $3,000 less on the electric side than the national average. And a big part of that has been fuel diversity. It's been our Steel for Fuel program and taking advantage of the wind production tax credit to really avail those cost decreases for our customers. So we need that to continue, right? Again, we think about this in two phases. And I think the diversity of resources Certainly, we saw this in Texas over the President's Day weekend, the importance of a diversity of resources through 2030, an important role for natural gas in its dispatchability and ability to integrate very, very high amounts of renewables. So think about it in two phases, right? Think about it through 2030, and then also think about it post 2030. We're going to need the resources we're deploying today, the wind and solar and storage. As coal plants continue to retire, we'll need to find ways to capture carbon or deploy new carbon-free dispatchable resources. So really thinking about it in two timeframes, but in both, there's no one technology. We don't set out to identify a single technology that is the solution. It's really going to be a portfolio. And I go back to the comment I made about electrification. If the power sector brings in new electric loads, as we refer to them, they all have a different load shape, right? Transportation charging, industrial applications, oil and gas compressor stations. They're all on and operating at different times of the day, different times of the year. So we're really going to need a robust portfolio to achieve that. I think it's pretty clear that electrification has emerged as probably one of the biggest, if not the biggest, climate strategy. And more thought around how do we get the rules right for carbon crediting, and how do we actually credit new resources that are going to be taking carbon out of other sectors of the economy through the power sector.
Great, thanks so much. We've had a couple of questions that have related. Lois is asking a little bit about kind of microgrids or potential for other solutions to some of the clean power transition. And I'd be curious to hear thoughts, maybe Heather, from you on thinking about some of the situation in Texas, the importance of power system reliability. So how do some of these technologies, and how would potentially a federal CES, can help support some of these questions about grid reliability?
So I think it's a great and very relevant question, obviously, and a lot of it goes back to kind of where Jeff landed on talking about the importance of a robust and diverse energy supply. And I think at the heart of the clean energy standard, it does ensure fuel diversity and therefore provides what most Americans take for granted in their electricity, which is reliability, security, and price stability. If one source becomes too scarce or expensive, a balanced system for generating power can turn to another source. And if the grid is tied too closely to one source, it risks shortages and price spikes. So the best available analysis that we've seen from the national labs and independent experts really support what Jeff was talking about, the view that America's changing power mix, particularly the shift to renewables, does not threaten reliability. Renewable energy can also be reliably integrated into the existing power mix without compromising the stability of the power sector. And Texas, I think the big lesson from Texas is that system flexibility actually helps address the potential hurdles facing a power system. And I think the last thing we learned from Texas is that renewables can provide a suite of essential grid reliability services.
Thanks, Heather. Brad, we have a question from Rosemary regarding the supply chain for some technologies, thinking of carbon footprint of all technologies, and in particular some of the potential waste issues related to build out of certain technologies like solar panels or wind turbines and their replacement. I was wondering if you'd thought much on some of these questions on the federal role, I guess, in thinking through some of the environmental questions around clean energy build out.
The circular economy is a great idea, and we need to work on it. I don't think that's, from our point of view, is a driving factor in the direction we need to take. We've got some fantastic technologies. If you look at the kind of downstream, from all kinds of energy, if you're downstream from coal, you've got coal ash ponds, right? If you're downstream from nuclear, you've got nuclear waste. And so we have a growing problem about what to do with wind turbine blades. These technologies do need to be replaced. Repowering of offshore wind or of wind turbines is a big job creator for us. You know, when a turbine's up there 10, 12, 15 years, there's a new, better model available. And I think probably Jeff is at the point where they're starting to consider what repowering looks like in some of their portfolio at this point. So yeah, it's a thing that's out there. I think we're a little more concerned with the front end and some of the issues that were being discussed around the ITCs, extending them into storage, and from our point of view, hydrogen, production tax credit for nuclear to make sure we're leveling the playing field, the permitting. Those are the things that we're really focused on. And the supply chain, we've got to get that work here. 48C is a thing. There was just a bill dropped yesterday. We'll see how that goes.
Thanks, Brad. A couple of our audience members have asked questions related to, like you were saying, you know, some of the more front-end policies, comparing the potential of CES policy to drive clean energy build out versus something more like a carbon fee with dividend. I was curious if any of you all thought about carbon pricing and how it fits in with kind of speeding some of the implementation side of new clean energy technologies.
So I would say, you know, as an organization, ACP supports a meaningful price on carbon. And I think we recognize there are a lot of different ways to internalize the cost of carbon that carbon emissions pose. And I think we see a variety of different opportunities to promote a smooth and affordable transition to that cleaner, more sustainable economy. So we'll continue to evaluate these options and help be an advocate on these, you know, long-term strategies to provide certainty and predictability. But I think for our member companies, there are a few core things that you know sort of sit at the center of our thinking around climate or carbon pricing. The first is that it needs to be market-based to drive low-cost solutions to best enable emissions reductions and economic growth. We need that policy be in line with scientific analysis that indicates the level of ambition needed to avoid the worst effects of climate change. We need clear, sustained, and sufficient investment in clean energy and associated infrastructure that will lead to meaningful emissions reductions, and that those policies are designed to leverage already available clean energy resources and take advantage of existing carbon abatement programs.
Well, the labor movement has not settled on support of carbon pricing. I think I could tell you there's been some discussion, and it, as I mentioned earlier, is sort of wraparound policies. Carbon pricing by itself does not achieve the things that the labor movement wants to achieve: good jobs, investment in communities. I could say that we're pretty settled that a carbon price with a dividend is not something that we're ever going to support. We think that the money needs to be reinvested into communities, into lowering the price of clean energy, into making sure that poor people are whole if there's an increase in costs. So, you know, a carbon price can drive efficiency. There's no question that a broad carbon price is extremely efficient across the whole economy. It doesn't get you places you need to go with transportation. For example, you know, you could have a very steep carbon price, a couple $100 a ton. It's not going to drive what we need to do in light duty vehicles. It just can't. So we still need some regulations.
Maybe just to add on that briefly, Leslie, if I could, I do think a carbon price, while it does provide a market signal, it doesn't solve a lot of the work that needs to be done. For example, it's not really intentional about new technology. Right, and that's what we like about a clean energy standard, that it really creates the R&D budget that's going to be needed at DOE in particular. It really is intentional about the technologies that move from the lab bench into first of a kind and then nth of a kind in commercial deployment. And so some advocates of a carbon tax or a carbon fee believe that will happen as a result of that policy. we think there needs to be far more detail put into the R&D aspects of it. And importantly, if you think about the 5 points that I outlined at the top, it doesn't really defer to states in their resource planning processes, right? It's really additive to it. And so it's important that the electric resource plans that we file with our state regulators is the place where these decisions are made. A carbon tax really, I think, is really violates that tenet.
Closing thoughts, Brad, maybe we'll go to you and then end with Heather. Just would love to hear, quick statements on what's key for getting your support, your organization's support for federal CES legislation.
The key for us is making sure that there are complementary policies that drive good job creation, that create the level of pay and benefits that exist in the fossil sector today, which is very high, and that we're investing in communities that are undergoing economic change.
And from ACP's perspective, I think it's that we are providing certainty and predictability in the marketplace, that we are driving down carbon emissions, and that we are embracing the need to ensure an equitable and just transition.
All right. Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists, Jeff, Brad, and Heather today. And thank you for sticking with us. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel for future notifications of Bipartisan Policy Center events. We're really thrilled that everybody was able to be here today for this conversation. Thanks again and take care.
Thank you.
Thanks.